My name is Melissa Rebronja, and I am an integrative healing practitioner at healyourheart.love. And today we have a very special guest, Carrie Gates. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Happy to serve.
Carrie is LA-based, like myself, and Carrie is an advanced certified grief recovery specialist, a mental health advocate, and a business consultant as well.
Correct.
Does that feel like the current you, Carrie?
Yes, it does. That is me to a T. I'm also a mom and an educator.
What inspired you to get into grief recovery work?
My inspiration was really born of a combination of things. One was my own experience with trauma and grief a few years ago. The second was the realization that we have a huge need in our country and in society in general right now for specialized mental health services. And grief is a topic that is not commonly addressed. And the third is I feel that my life experiences and my own skill set and my background gives me sort of a unique perspective and a unique advantage where it feels a purpose and a passion in me for sure, and that I feel that I bring unique value to the table. So sort of a combination of all those things evolved into what I do now.
So tell me a little more about your experience with grief and trauma and what led you into this work.
In 2017, I experienced a really difficult period in my life, and there was a lot of things happening in my life at that time. I had several people who were very close in my inner circle pass away very unexpectedly, tragically, and without any warning. Some of those deaths were, heart attack, car accident, alcohol related, by suicide, and that was all very, very sudden and tragic and unexpected for me. And I wasn't quite sure how to process that. And at the same time that all of that was going on, I have two young children who were seniors in high school or junior in high school, and struggling with a lot of the challenges about becoming an adult and leaving home for the first time and entering the adult world. And kids today are under a lot of pressure in terms of choosing a college and a career path or what they're going to do after high school and leaving home for the first time. Those are hard decisions, especially when the adults around you are suddenly passing away and things like that. It doesn't make becoming an adult look very attractive. I didn't feel like being an adult at that time was very attractive. And then just a lot of other stress in my life at the same time. My marriage was going through a really hard time and on the verge of divorce, and I was having some health issues of my own. And so really for me, it was sort of a perfect storm. I had a lot of grief in my friendship circle, my inner circle, my social life, my personal life, my professional life, my faith life. Loss of faith was something that I had experienced as a clergy kid from a very young age. And so really, I just was not at all equipped to deal with something of that magnitude and to deal with so many things all at once. It felt like everything was coming down all at once. And so at the time, I was just trying to make sense of how did I get here? It's like watching a hurricane on a weather map, right? Like, how did I get here? And what do I need to do to get out of that? So I went and started looking for help. And I did find some things that were helpful and helped me move forward. And then I found some other things that just didn't quite give me what I needed.
You do a certain method of working with grief, and I actually went through the process. And
You were my very first pilot test client.
Yes, and the funny thing about that, Carrie, is that I thought when you asked me that it was just going to be like one session. So I was like, sure. And then I realized that it's actually like a 8-session process. So we went through that, and I am so glad that I did, because even though I've done so much work in healing, that did feel like a very different and unique way of healing. I have the book here. Tell us a little bit about your method of working with grief?
I found the grief recovery method several years ago after I had experienced some trauma and grief in my own life. And I sought out a bunch of different modalities and different methods in terms of trying to cope with my own grief. And what I found was there's a lot of helpful things in a lot of different programs, but there's also a lot of harmful things in some programs. And it just didn't give me quite what I needed to really heal that and to move forward from that. And what I like about the grief recovery method is it's different from traditional therapy in that it is a closed-ended educational program where there's a handbook and homework and reading and writing assignments. And, it is sort of a format. It's not like traditional therapy, psychotherapy, where you go and you sit on a couch and you talk open-endedly for sort of an unspecific period of time. It defines very specific grief goals, a particular loss that you want to work on, and is very educational in terms of uncovering some of the myths that we've been taught about grief. I know all of my life, and I was one too, that always associated grief with death and loss with death. And loss isn't just death. Loss is also loss of safety and security, loss of normalcy, loss of faith. There's over 40 different types of losses. Some of them are intangible types of losses. Some are tangible, like pet loss, divorce, breakup, job loss, things like that. But there's also intangible losses like safety and security, loss of control over one's body, loss of choice. Choice is a huge one for grievers because obviously if we could have chosen to have something different, better, or more, we would have. It addresses a lot of different types of losses, and there are action steps and there are tasks sort of associated with that help people bring completion to that, because we've learned that grief is cumulative and cumulatively negative. So from a very young age, we're taught certain things about grief, and a lot of times that grief stacks up over time. And how we react in present day to incomplete grief from the past, the brains are programmable, right? Like information that we're programmed and that we're taught from an early age sometimes feels like being taught how to paint a wall with a screwdriver. You don't necessarily have the right tool to accomplish
Right.
what you're trying to accomplish. What I really like about the grief recovery method is that it gives a lot of educational information, clarifies a lot of misinformation that maybe we've been taught, and it gives people effective tools for coping with loss that they can then take and incorporate into their rest of their life. So typically in a grief recovery session or a group of sessions like you and I did, we focus on one specific loss, but you can take that same formula and apply it to other losses in your life. So then you're equipped with the effective tools that you need to handle other losses in your life. So it's not a lifelong commitment.
Yes, I was going to say that my favorite part of working this process was getting to the loss history graph and then doing the relationship graph. I really found that helpful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Prior to finding the grief recovery method, I had tried a bunch of different types of modalities. I tried a 12-step program for Al-Anon and for adult children of alcoholics, and I tried traditional psychotherapy. I tried a grief support group through a church and some other things. And all of those things were missing for me, some of those tools, and didn't really address what I needed in order to heal from those particular losses. And the program itself was created by a gentleman named John James, who was a previous military person. I believe he was in the Marine Corps, and he lost a son when he was an adult, and just realized his experience was similar to mine, and that he did not find the tools that he needed in a lot of different modalities in order to heal from that. I think that the grief recovery method is very appropriate for people who have experienced trauma. Religion plays a big part in my background, and certain programs can be very shame-based. I think for me personally, 12-step programs were hugely educational and hugely beneficial. I think a lot of people can benefit from that, but I personally had a problem with some of the language in the 12-step programs. Asking God to restore my sanity, or a defect of character, humbly asking God to remove a defect of character. I'm not
Right.
responsible for what I did not learn as a child. I did not have the tools to deal with grief of that magnitude where I was at that particular period of my life. And that doesn't make me defective as a person. And
Yeah.
I love that the grief recovery method is very non judgy, non shame based, just sort of learning
Yeah.
how to lay it all out and to apply appropriate skills to appropriate losses and sort of working through that. So that was one of the things I loved about that. And that, yeah, working through loss history and other things affects how we deal with grief in our adult life, right?
Absolutely. And so what I liked when I worked with you, I think I chose a breakup and it was very helpful. And I plan to go back and do other losses or relationships because I especially liked the apologies, forgiveness, and then there was the third thing was,
Significant emotional statements.
yeah, that was
That
so
was another
powerful.
thing. Forgiveness and apologies are only true if that's actually true for you. And I
Yes.
think that is one of the myths of grief that we're taught from a young age. Well, you have to forgive the person and move on from it. You don't have to, you're not obligated to forgive a person or situation unless that's truly true for you. And guilting people into, oh, well, you have to forgive them, or oh, that was 60 years ago. You don't have to forgive someone. So learning how to apply significant emotional statements and acknowledging the impact that a particular behavior or situation had on your life is critically important into healing that pain and moving forward. But you're not obligated to forgive. And
Absolutely.
forgiveness doesn't always mean forget either. You can forgive a situation or a person for something that happened and still not forget what
Yeah.
happened.
And what I like about this process is really about us. Like what do I need to let go of that relationship or just to heal? But as I've been on my healing journey, I suddenly came to a realization that I was affected by a bunch of suicides that happened in my life. And I did not realize that, Carrie. And it started off with one of a friend in 2011. And then I think that was the initial one. It's weird to say the first one, but that was the first one that was relevant to my life. And it was such a shock. And I feel like I allowed myself to be affected and I really showed up for the friends and family of this person. And then there was like some suicides that happened after that. One was like a friend, another one was two people that are more like acquaintances. And then I realized that I also had a client that committed suicide, but it wasn't like a long-term client, but just somebody that I worked with. And all these experiences have changed me. I finally had that revelation. I definitely want to go back to the book. It was just very interesting to me that I was not aware of it had such an effect on me.
Yeah. Suicide is a huge loss. I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
My
Yeah.
life has also been impacted by suicide, and that is one of the many things that I have learned since then. Each griever is unique, and each griever's relationship to their particular loss is unique. So, your experience with suicide and my experience are very different. The commonality in that sometimes is how we tend to cope with those things or how we are taught to cope with those things from a young age. And, for me, some of those things were I just hearing what you just said and reflecting back on my own experience when someone in my family died by suicide was some of the things that you just said. I felt very compelled to be strong for others, that I had to be there for my friends and family and other things. But I really, in my heart, needed to own my own pain and my own relationship to that situation. And each person in that situation had a different relationship with that person and a different relationship with that loss. And understanding that I still have the ability to experience that loss, even though we teach people, right? You need to be strong for others. Well, it wasn't your, best friend, husband, whoever, like quantifying that relationship. It's still a loss that we experience within our heart that we don't have to quantify in comparison to other people's loss, just because other people have it so much worse. Or as we learn in, I call it collective grief, when say someone like a celebrity, like a Robin Williams or a Kate Spade, or someone dies by suicide, maybe you didn't know that person specifically. Like a few minutes ago, when I just heard you say, well, it was a client of mine, but I didn't know them really well. It doesn't matter if you, or I hadn't seen them in a long time, or I hadn't seen that friend in a long time. You don't have to quantify that relationship. You can still have an emotional response to that loss. Loss is an inevitable part of life, and grief is a very normal and natural response to that. And oftentimes we're taught from an early age how to invalidate our own grief and compare ourselves to others. Well, it wasn't your this, or it wasn't a person, it was just a pet, or it was a client, not a friend, or a coworker, and not a, it doesn't matter. You still have an emotional connection, an emotional relationship with that loss. And our relationship with that situation doesn't end when the life of a person ends. You can still have a relationship with someone or something long after they're gone. And being able to work through some of those complex emotions and allowing yourself a safe space to look at what your experience with that is really important. The other thing I heard you say, unusual to experience several suicides. It's not actually that unusual as one would think. It's just not frequently talked about. Something that I learned after my own experience with suicide is that was not the first person that I have encountered in my life to die by suicide. And the more I started to talk about that openly, the more I realized that almost everyone we know has experienced suicide in some shape or form. And I
Right.
think if we were to go into a room of 50 people and say, if you know of anyone, if you've ever contemplated suicide, raise your hand. Half the room might raise their hand. And then if you know of anyone that committed suicide, raise your hand. All these hands start to go up. And it's just, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment that comes with talking about when someone dies by suicide or when someone has contemplated suicide.
What's interesting is that there's a part of me that feels like when the first one happened, that my innocence was somehow taken away. There is also anger as well. And especially, like, I think three out of the 4 or 5 people that I knew have had children. So there's a part of me that is like, oh my God, you left children behind. Is it normal to experience anger when it comes
Yes.
to, okay.
Yes, it is very normal to experience anger. It is very normal to experience guilt. It
Yeah.
is very normal to feel a loss of innocence, that something in you has changed forever.
Yes,
Death
thank
is
you.
a very hard thing to experience under natural circumstance. Suicide brings with it a different layer of anger and guilt and self-questioning and other things, because the person has left for different reasons than what one might expect, and that has to do with our own expectations. And I know my impression of suicide changed drastically in 2017 when someone that I was very close to died by suicide, and there was a loss of innocence there, and there was children that were left behind. That person's children, my children who had a relationship with that person, a lot of people were impacted by that. And loss of innocence is one. And it's normal to question yourself. If a child's parents die by suicide, did my parent love me? Was my love not enough? Was my friendship not enough?
Yeah.
Like in your case,
Yeah.
why didn't they reach out to me? Was I not an approachable friend? What could I have done differently? Why didn't I see the signs? Or guilty feelings of, well, gosh, I haven't called that person in a long time. Maybe I should have reached out sooner. There's a lot of undelivered communication there. And
Yeah.
grief healing also is about a lot of that undelivered communication and working through some of those complex feelings, because loss of innocence is a definite loss related to suicide and related to death of any kind, and loss of safety and security, and just your own internal sense of safety and security. And there's, a lot of sadness and a lot of anger and sometimes religious or faith-based confusion or feelings associated with that. People have different beliefs when it comes to their faith as to what happens to the soul after one passes. And a lot of religions have faith-based beliefs that might be hard for the family left behind to cope with and to deal with that loss. It's a pretty complex situation. There's a lot of stigma associated with suicide. You'll see, out there on the internet and Facebook and a lot of places and in a lot of conversations, people say it's okay to not be okay. Ask for help if you're struggling with something. We say that, but that is not the reality of the society that we live in. Saying that it's okay to not be okay makes certain assumptions that are not always true. It makes the assumption that the person is in a safe place, a safe environment where it is okay to disclose that they are struggling with mental health issues. It makes the assumption that you have financial resources to access help. And it makes the assumption that help is accessible to you. And that is not true in every case of the situation. If you are if a person who is struggling with some internal emotional issues and having a hard time getting past that, if they disclose to their employer that they are struggling, that can result in job loss, that can result in lack of promotion, gossip. I grew up in a clergy family. I had a backstage pass to a lot of the dysfunction in organized religion, and religion helps a lot of people, but sometimes it's hurtful. And if you are a member of clergy or clergy staff, if you are a member of active duty military or law enforcement or other things, and you disclose that you are having some mental health issues, you will immediately be put on involuntary unpaid leave of absence. Not everyone can afford to go without their paycheck. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to deal with that shame. They can't afford that. And so there's a stigma and some hardship associated with that. The second is financial resources. I mean, as we saw in the pandemic, when quarantine happened, the average American citizen does not have $2,000 extra discretionary income when things shut down. And not everyone has health insurance that has mental health care benefits. Not everyone has the financial resources to pay for therapeutic services. A lot of therapeutic services do not accept insurance. But, there's a financial barrier of entry there too, in terms of getting help. The third is accessibility of care. And I know from my own experience, when I decided to, that I felt a little overwhelmed with grief and I wanted to get help, I probably called 50 different therapists, maybe 5 called me back. Of the 5, 4 don't take insurance. And depending upon where you live, for veterans, if you're not living in an area where there's a metropolitan VA that has the resources to deal with the caseload that they have, you might not get the help that you need. So accessibility of care, quality of care, a lot of therapists that I've talked to, and I have a lot of family that's in the therapeutic field, grief is a topic that they spend like 3 days on in grad school. So even, traditional therapeutic services or psychotherapy or grief groups, or 12-step programs, those are peer-led, and they're not really designed to deal specifically with the topic of grief. And there's a lot of confusion about what that is. And so when people are struggling with grief or mental health challenges in their own life, they have a hard time speaking up, and society looks at people who die by suicide as maybe a cowardly act or a selfish act. That's not the case. That's just someone who is desperate to make the pain stop.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah. It's a heavy subject, and I am grateful for people like you.
I was raised in a clergy family and in a family that also had a lot of really strong ties to the defense industry. So my biological father and my stepmother were both ordained clergy. My great great grandfather was a theologian, clergy family where I was preacher's kid, dual preacher's kid. My grandfather was aerospace industry. He was a key executive in the aerospace industry. My stepfather worked for NASA. He was a thermodynamic engineer for NASA. And my first husband was in the military when we first met and started dating. And, there's a lot of parallels there between clergy families and military families and frequently moving around. My family moved every year to a new school. I was perpetually the new kid in school every year, so that gives me a unique background into of those unique life experiences.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share in closing?
What I see currently happening in the world is we are living in some very challenging times. We've had 2 decades of war. We have the highest number of military veterans that we've ever had. They all have their own unique experience and their own set of grief around that experience. We've lived with several decades of religious scandal and other things, whether it be the Catholic Church scandal or other types of religious scandals. We have more political division than we've ever experienced. We're sort of in a perfect storm in our society right now. And I think that grief is encapsulated in a lot of that. And in terms of healing all of that, those are all issues that we need to be able to address and have more effective coping skills in terms of working through those losses and our emotional feelings around those losses. We tend to live up here and not in here. And a lot of the tools that we're taught from a young age, I was taught a lot of the things that most people were taught. Oh, give it time. Time heals all wounds. Pray about it. Things like that, that aren't necessarily giving me the tools that I need in order to heal from that loss. And I think that we also live in Western culture that loves to slap labels on things. Almost everything is considered a disorder, an illness, a syndrome, this or that. And a lot of those times, it's just misdiagnosed grief and misdiagnosed trauma. And trauma really is a fancy word for loss because there's a lot of loss in that. And in terms of trauma healing and trauma recovery, we have to work through the grief of that. Simply labeling someone as having an anxiety disorder and prescribing a certain medication and saying, well, this is your condition and you have to live with that forever doesn't necessarily help the person overcome what's in their heart. And for most of us, it's not, we're not crazy or broken or insane. We just have feelings that we don't know how to move past. And so helping people who feel sort of lost or stuck or aren't sure why or have a hard time articulating that is particularly important. Healing the emotions rather than up here, not how I think about it, but how I feel about it. And getting out of our head and into our heart and able to heal that keeps us, if we're not able to do that, that keeps us from moving forward. I think a healer's job is to help you find your truth and to help find what helps you move forward, not to sell you on their particular method. And not to keep you addicted to their particular method. So if someone is telling you that it has to be their way and that you have to continue to do that forever, it's okay to outgrow your pain. It's okay to heal and to move forward. And it's okay to not make that trauma be a part of your identity and who you are forever. It's okay to rise and step out of that.
And do you work with people online or in person?
I am certified to do online as well, so I can do in person or online. And right now I have both, and I work with clients in a multitude of states. So even though I am based here in Southern California, I have clients in several different states, the Midwest, the South, the East Coast. I have clients all over. So, and my clients are both men and women. I do have clients in a variety of different categories, and some of the losses that we work through are prior history of sexual abuse or religious issues or death of someone who died by suicide or some of those other losses. Some of them are mid-career life change. I do have clients that I've worked with that are empty nesters. I take all of the above.
Thank you.
And how can people contact you?
People can contact me through my webpage, or through social media, by phone, email. I have a specific Instagram page for grief recovery called Carrie Gates Grief Recovery. So I do have an account that I use, for educational purposes to help people understand what grief is and to end some of the, awkwardness of that conversation. Grief is a topic that people feel awkward about or assume that it just has to do with death. So
Thank you for being here today. And we look forward to having you again in the future.
happy to serve.